I was 8 years old when I heard my father say the words that would haunt me forever. You take Margaret, I'll keep Thomas. Sarah, she goes to the orphanage. 40 years later, when they desperately needed my help, they discovered that the rejected daughter had become the most powerful person in their lives, but what they didn't know was that their decision to abandon me would eventually destroy our family forever. If you're watching this from a difficult family situation, drop a comment below with the word strength and subscribe to see how I turned my parents' betrayal into the ultimate lesson in justice. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how the unwanted child became the one holding all the cards. It was a cold December morning in 1983 when everything changed. I remember the smell of my grandmother's lavender perfume still lingering in the house, even though she had passed away 3 days earlier. The old Victorian home in Portland felt emptier than it ever had, with its creaking wooden floors and tall windows that let in streams of gray winter light. I was sitting on the faded floral carpet in the living room, playing with my grandmother's jewelry box, listening to the tiny ballerina spin to a haunting melody. My siblings, Margaret, 12, and Thomas, 10, were upstairs packing their belongings. The murmur of my parents' voices drifted from the kitchen, where they sat around the old oak table with steaming cups of coffee and a pile of legal documents. We can't afford to keep all three, my mother, Linda, whispered, though her voice carried clearly through the thin walls. With mother gone, we don't have her income anymore. And the house payments, ... double quotes. I know, my father, Robert, replied heavily, but we have to think practically. Margaret is almost a teenager. She can help with household chores. Thomas is a boy. He'll carry on the family name. There was a long pause. I stopped winding the jewelry box, my small hands frozen on the golden key. And Sarah, my mother asked, her voice barely audible. Sarah, ... double quotes. My father's voice grew cold, distant. She's young enough to adapt. The St. Mary's Children's Home has a good reputation. She'll be fine. The jewelry box slipped from my hands, crashing to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. The tiny ballerina's head broke off, rolling across the carpet like a lost tear. That's when I understood that my parents weren't just discussing financial difficulties. They were deciding which of their children was worth keeping. 2 days later, I stood at the front door with a small suitcase containing everything I owned: 3 dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, a worn teddy bear named Mr. Buttons, and the broken ballerina from grandmother's jewelry box. My mother knelt down to my level, her eyes red from crying, though I wasn't sure if the tears were for me or for the situation. You'll be happy there, sweetheart, she said, straightening my coat collar with trembling hands. The nuns will take good care of you, and maybe someday, ... double quotes. She never finished that sentence. My father stood behind her, tall and imposing in his wool coat, checking his watch impatiently. He didn't look at me directly, instead focusing on some point beyond my shoulder. Say goodbye to your brother and sister, he instructed, his voice flat and businesslike. Margaret hugged me briefly, whispering I'm sorry into my ear before pulling away quickly. Thomas just waved from the top of the stairs, too confused by the adult complications to understand what was really happening. The drive to St. Mary's took 37 minutes. I counted every single one on the dashboard clock, memorizing the route through downtown Portland, past the bridge over the Willamette River, and into the residential area where the orphanage stood like a red brick fortress against the gray December sky. Sister Catherine, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, met us at the heavy wooden doors. She had gentle brown eyes and hands that smelled of soap and kindness. She knelt down to my level immediately. Hello, Sarah, she said softly. I'm Sister Catherine. Would you like to see your new room? I nodded, not trusting my voice. When I turned back for one last look at my parents, their car was already pulling away from the curb. They didn't wave goodbye, but that was just the beginning of my journey to discover who I really was. The first few months at St. Mary's were the hardest of my young life. I shared a dormitory room with 7 other girls, ages ranging from 6 to 16. The beds were narrow and the blankets thin, but Sister Catherine made sure each of us had a small wooden cross above our beds and a drawer for our personal belongings. I placed the broken ballerina in my drawer, along with Mr. Buttons and a photograph of my family taken the previous Christmas, back when I still believed I belonged with them. The routine at St. Mary's was strict but predictable. We woke at 6:30 for morning prayers, followed by breakfast in the large dining hall with its long wooden tables and mismatched chairs. The oatmeal was often lumpy and the orange juice watered down, but it was warm and filling. School was held in the orphanage's own classrooms, with volunteer teachers from the community. Mrs. Patterson, a retired elementary school teacher with silver hair and patience that seemed endless, became my favorite. She noticed immediately that I could read above my grade level and began giving me extra books to challenge my growing mind. "You have a gift, Sarah," she told me one afternoon as I finished a book meant for sick. "Promise me you'll never waste it." I promised, though at 8 years old, I had no idea how prophetic those words would become. The nights were the hardest. In the darkness of the dormitory, listening to the soft breathing and occasional sobs of the other girls, I would clutch Mr. Buttons and wonder what my siblings were doing. Were they eating dinner at our old kitchen table? Was Margaret helping with dishes the way I used to? Did Thomas still have nightmares about monsters under his bed? Did they ever think about me at all? Sister Catherine often found me sitting by the window in the common room, watching the cars pass by on the street outside. She would sit beside me, her presence comforting and solid. "Someday, you'll understand that God has a plan for you, Sarah," she would say gently. Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations. I wanted to believe her, but at 8 years old, all I could see was the pain of being unwanted. Years passed, and I grew from a confused little girl into a determined young woman. By age 12, I was tutoring younger children in reading and mathematics. By 14, I was working in the orphanage's office, helping with filing and basic administrative tasks. By 16, I had earned a full scholarship to Portland State University. Sister Catherine called me into her office the day the acceptance letter arrived. The afternoon sun streamed through her window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny miracles. "Sarah," she said, holding the letter with hands that had grown more wrinkled over the years, "you've been given an extraordinary opportunity. This scholarship covers everything: tuition, books, room, and board." I stared at the letter, hardly daring to believe it was real. "Sister Catherine, what if I'm not smart enough? What if I don't belong there either?" She stood up and came around her desk, placing both hands on my shoulders. "Child, you've spent 8 years proving that you belong wherever you choose to put your mind and heart. Don't let fear rob you of your future." On my 18th birthday, as I prepared to leave St. Mary's for college, I received an unexpected letter. My hands shook as I recognized the return address, my childhood home in Portland. But then something happened that I never expected. The letter wasn't from my parents. It was from a law firm, Henderson and Associates, informing me that my grandmother had left a trust fund in my name, accessible only when I turned 18. The amount was modest, $25,000, but it included a handwritten note from my grandmother. "My dearest Sarah," the note read in her familiar shaky handwriting, "I always knew you were special. This money is to help you build the life you deserve. Never let anyone make you feel unwanted again. You are loved more than you know. Find your strength, my precious girl." I sat on my narrow bed at St. Mary's, tears streaming down my face as I held the note. My grandmother had remembered me. Even when my parents chose to forget I existed, she had made sure I would have something to help me start over. That night, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I would not just survive, I would excel. I would become someone so successful, so accomplished, that no one would ever be able to discard me again. I enrolled in pre-law at Portland State, driven by a burning desire to understand justice, to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. I worked part-time at a legal aid clinic, tutored struggling students for extra money, and studied with intensity that surprised even my professors. My childhood at St. Mary's had taught me discipline, empathy, and resilience. While my classmates partied and enjoyed typical college experiences, I was building the foundation for something bigger. By my junior year, I was on the dean's list. By my senior year, I had been accepted to several law schools with full scholarships. I chose Columbia Law School in New York, partly for its prestige, but mostly because it was 3,000 miles away from Portland and the family that had abandoned me. At Columbia, I specialized in family law and estate planning. Perhaps it was no coincidence that I was drawn to the very areas of law that governed the relationships and decisions that had shaped my own painful childhood. I graduated summa cum laude and was recruited by one of New York's most prestigious law firms, Morrison, Klein and Associates. I started as a junior associate, working 100-hour weeks, building a reputation for being thorough, brilliant, and absolutely relentless when fighting for my clients. Years blurred together in a whirlwind of cases, courtrooms, and 18-hour days. I specialized in complex family disputes, inheritance cases, and child custody battles. Every time I fought for a child's rights, every time I ensured a fair distribution of assets, I was fighting for that 8-year-old girl who had been deemed not worth keeping. By age 35, I had made partner. By 40, I was one of the most sought-after family law attorneys on the East Coast. I had a corner office on the 42nd floor, with a view of Central Park, a penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, and a reputation that made opposing lawyers nervous. I had built the life my grandmother dreamed for me, but there was still an empty space where my family should have been. I never married. How could I trust someone not to abandon me the way my parents had? I never had children. How could I risk putting a child through what I had experienced? For decades, I convinced myself that I was complete, that success was enough. I drove myself harder, took on bigger cases, earned more money, gained more recognition. But late at night, in my empty penthouse, I sometimes still felt like that 8-year-old girl watching cars pass by the window at St. Mary's. Then, on a rainy Thursday morning in October 2023, my secretary knocked on my office door with an urgent expression. "Ms. Mitchell," she said hesitantly, "there's a call for you on line 3. The gentleman says it's a family emergency." I had been Sarah Mitchell for so long that I had almost forgotten I was once Sarah Morrison. Almost. So when my phone rang with that desperate call, everything I had spent 40 years building was about to collide with everything I had spent 40 years trying to forget. I stared at the blinking light on line 3 for a full minute before picking up the phone. My hand was surprisingly steady, though my heart was racing. "Sarah Mitchell speaking," I said in my professional attorney voice. "Sarah, is this really you?" The voice was older, shakier, but unmistakably my father's. 40 years of silence crashed between us like a wave. I could hear him breathing on the other end. Could picture him exactly as he was the last time I saw him. Tall, stern, checking his watch impatiently. "Hello, Robert," I said, deliberately using his first name instead of Dad. "This is unexpected." "Sarah, we. He struggled with the words. "We need your help. We're in serious legal trouble. And the lawyers here in Portland say you're one of the best family law attorneys in the country." The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. The family that had discarded me was now calling me for help because I had become exactly what they never thought I could be. "What kind of legal trouble?" I asked, slipping into my attorney mode automatically. "It's about your grandmother's estate," he said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. "There are complications we never knew about. Margaret and Thomas are involved, and there's a lawsuit that could cost us everything. We could lose the house, our retirement savings, everything." I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out at Central Park where the autumn leaves were turning gold and red. The little girl in me wanted to hang up immediately, but the attorney in me was curious. "How did you find me?" I asked. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "We hired a private investigator. Sarah, I know we have a lot to talk about, but right now we just need the best legal help we can get. Will you at least consider taking our case?" I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 4 decades pressing down on me. "I'll need to review all the documents first. Send everything to my office." "Does that mean you'll help us?" I paused, savoring the power of that moment. "It means I'll consider it, on my terms." After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the rain streak down my windows. The scared little girl inside me was trembling. But the successful attorney I had become was already calculating the possibilities. 3 days later, a thick package arrived at my office via overnight mail. As I spread the documents across my conference table, I began to understand the magnitude of my family's crisis, and my own unexpected power in their situation. But what I discovered in those documents would change everything I thought I knew about my childhood and the real reason I had been sent away. The documents told a story that made my blood run cold. My grandmother's will, which I had never seen in its entirety, revealed that she had left not just a small trust fund for me, but had actually designated me as the primary beneficiary of her entire estate, the house, investments, and over $2 million in assets. But there was more. A secondary document, signed just months before her death, revealed the truth that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. I wasn't Robert and Linda Morrison's biological daughter. I had been adopted as an infant through a private arrangement, and my grandmother had been paying my parents a monthly stipend for my care money. that was supposed to be put aside for my education and future. The adoption papers were there, along with bank records showing that my parents had been receiving $3,000 a month for my care from my grandmother's account, money that had mysteriously stopped being deposited into any account for my benefit after I was sent to the orphanage. My hands shook as I read my grandmother's final letter. Attached to the will, to my beloved granddaughter Sarah, though not born of my blood, you are the child of my heart. I have discovered that Robert and Linda have been using the money intended for your care for their own purposes. I fear they plan to abandon you after my death. This will ensure that you, as my chosen heir, will inherit what was always meant to be yours. Find justice, my dear girl. Make them answer for what they have done. I sat in my conference room until well past midnight. The documents spread before me like pieces of a puzzle that finally revealed the complete picture. My parents hadn't just abandoned me because they couldn't afford 3 children. They had abandoned me while stealing the money that was meant to secure my future. And now, through a cosmic twist of justice, they needed me to save them from losing everything. The lawsuit they faced was from Margaret and Thomas, who had discovered the truth about the estate and were claiming that our parents had defrauded the family through financial mismanagement. They wanted the house and remaining assets to compensate for their own financial struggles. But what none of them knew was that legally, I owned everything. The house, the investments, even the money they were fighting over. It was all mine, and had been since my grandmother's death 40 years ago. I had the power to save them or destroy them completely. The next morning, I called my father back. I've reviewed your case, I said professionally. I'll take it, but I have conditions. Anything, he said immediately. What do you need? First, I want a family meeting with all of you, Linda, Margaret, and Thomas, in person, here in New York. Sarah, the travel expenses, ... double quotes, I'll cover them, I said. Second, I want complete honesty about everything that happened after grandmother's death. No lies, no omissions. Of course. Third, you'll accept my legal strategy without question, even if you don't understand it. There was a pause. All right. When do you want us to come? This weekend. I'll have my assistant arrange everything. After I hung up, I walked to my window and looked down at the busy street below. 40 years ago, I had been a powerless child watching cars drive away. Now I was about to orchestrate the most important family reunion of my life. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just planning to save them. I was planning to give them exactly what they deserved. Saturday afternoon, they walked into my conference room like ghosts from a past I had spent decades trying to forget. My father was 78 now, stooped and gray, wearing a suit that had seen better days. My mother, 75, moved carefully with a walker, her once bright blue eyes now clouded with cataracts. Margaret, now 52, looked tired and worn, her auburn hair streaked with silver. Thomas, 50, had inherited our father's height but not his confidence. He fidgeted nervously with his tie and avoided eye contact. They sat around my polished conference table, clearly intimidated by the opulent surroundings, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the original artwork, the view of Central Park that spoke of success beyond their imagination. I entered wearing my most expensive suit, my silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, carrying myself with the authority I had earned through 4 decades of hard work. I saw their eyes widen as they took in what their abandoned daughter had become. Thank you for coming, I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. Before we discuss your legal situation, I have some questions. My father cleared his throat nervously. Sarah, I want you to know how proud we are of what you've accomplished. When we heard you had become such a successful lawyer... Stop, I said quietly, but with enough force to silence him immediately. Let's establish some ground rules. You are here as clients seeking legal representation. I am here as an attorney who specializes in family law and estate planning. This is not a reunion. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Now, I continued, I want you to tell me exactly what happened after grandmother's death. And I want the truth this time. My father exchanged a glance with my mother before beginning. After mother died, we were struggling financially. The house payments, Margaret's school expenses, Thomas's medical bills. What medical bills? I asked. Thomas was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes that year. My mother spoke up. The treatments were expensive, and our insurance didn't cover everything. I made a note, though I already knew this from the documents. Continue. We made a difficult decision, my father said. We thought you would have a better life at St. Mary's. They had resources we couldn't provide. Education opportunities, double quotes. You thought I would have a better life, I repeated slowly, without a family. The pain in my voice seemed to hit them like a physical blow. Margaret started crying softly. We were young, my mother whispered. We were scared. We didn't know what else to do. You were receiving $3,000 a month from grandmother for my care, I said, watching their faces carefully. Money that was supposed to be saved for my education. My father went pale. How did you, double quotes. I'm a very good attorney, Robert. I know how to investigate financial records. I leaned forward. What happened to that money? The confession came out in halting pieces. They had used the money for the house payments, for Thomas's medical expenses, for Margaret's private school tuition. They had told themselves it was temporary, that they would pay it back when things got better. But things never got better, and I never came home. We thought about bringing you back, my mother said through her tears. Every birthday, every Christmas, we talked about it. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to explain. So you chose to pretend I never existed, I said. No, Margaret spoke up for the first time. We never forgot you, Sarah. I kept your picture in my room, all through high school. Thomas used to ask about you constantly. I looked at my siblings, strangers who shared my childhood but not my memories of it. Yet neither of you ever tried to contact me. Not once in 40 years. We didn't think you'd want to hear from us, Thomas said quietly. After what they did, I stood up and walked to the window. Looking out at the park where children were playing on the playground below, children with families who wanted them. Do you know what the hardest part was? I asked without turning around. It wasn't the orphanage. Sister Catherine and the other nuns were kind. It wasn't the poverty, or the institutional food, or sharing a room with 7 other girls. I turned back to face them. The hardest part was believing that I was unworthy of love, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me disposable. My mother was sobbing now. Sarah, please, double quotes. I spent years in therapy learning to trust people. I never married because I was terrified of being abandoned again. I never had children because I couldn't bear the thought of them feeling what I felt. I walked back to my chair but remained standing. You stole my childhood, my sense of family, my ability to believe I was worthy of love, and you stole 40 years of my life trying to prove to myself that I mattered. The room was silent except for my mother's quiet crying. But here's what you don't know, I said, my voice growing stronger. Grandmother knew what you had done. She changed her will before she died. I placed a copy of the will in front of each of them and watched their faces as they read. Everything you think you own, the house, the remaining investments, even the money you're fighting with Margaret and Thomas about, it all legally belongs to me. It has for 40 years. My father's hands were shaking as he read. This can't be right. It's completely legal and ironclad. I had 3 independent law firms verify it. I sat down, enjoying the moment of absolute power, which brings us to your current situation. I explained their legal position with clinical precision. Margaret and Thomas were suing, claiming financial mismanagement and demanding their share of assets that legally belonged to me. If they lost the lawsuit, they would lose the house and face potential fraud charges. But if I stepped forward as the legal owner of the estate, I could resolve everything immediately. So you see, I concluded, I have the power to save you completely, or I can let the lawsuit proceed and watch you lose everything. The choice is entirely mine. The silence stretched on for several minutes. Finally, my father spoke. What do you want from us, Sarah? I had waited 40 years to answer that question. I want you to face the truth about what you did, I said, publicly. I outlined my terms with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. They would appear at a press conference where they would acknowledge their actions, the abandonment, the financial fraud, the decades of silence. They would establish a foundation for children aging out of foster care, funded by the estate that was rightfully mine. The foundation will be called the Sarah Morrison Foundation for Forgotten Children, I said, and you will work there, without salary, for the rest of your able-bodied lives. My mother looked up through her tears. And if we agree to this, then I will settle the lawsuit quietly. You can remain in the house until your deaths, and you will have enough to live on modestly but comfortably. And if we don't agree, my father asked, then I will claim the full estate, as is my legal right. You will face the fraud charges that Margaret and Thomas are pursuing, and you will lose everything. I stood up again. I need your answer by Monday morning. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, my mother approached me hesitantly. Sarah, she whispered, do you think you could ever forgive us? I looked at the woman who had once been my mother, seeing for the first time not the powerful figure from my childhood memories, but a frail, elderly woman facing the consequences of choices made decades ago. I already have forgiven you, I said quietly. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice, and it's about making sure no other child goes through what I did. That Monday morning, they called to accept my terms. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the Portland Convention Center, looking out at an audience of social workers, foster care advocates, journalists, and families touched by the child welfare system. Behind me sat my parents, Margaret and Thomas, no longer my adversaries, but my reluctant partners in redemption. The Sarah Morrison Foundation for Forgotten Children had already placed its first dozen children in loving homes, provided college scholarships to foster care graduates, and established a legal aid clinic for families navigating the adoption system. The little girl who was sent away 40 years ago, I said into the microphone, could never have imagined this moment, not because she lacked dreams, but because she had forgotten how to dream at all. I looked back at my family, seeing them truly for the first time, not as the giants who had once held power over me, but as flawed human beings who had made terrible choices and were now trying to make amends. Today, we honor not just the children who have been forgotten, but the possibility that every ending can become a new beginning, that every rejection can become the foundation for something beautiful. My father was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered face. My mother gripped her walker with shaking hands. Margaret and Thomas sat side by side, united for the first time in decades. After the ceremony, as the crowds dispersed and the media packed up their equipment, my father approached me slowly. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, would it be all right if I hugged you?" I looked at this broken man who had once seemed so powerful, so final in his decisions. The scared 8-year-old in me wanted to run away, but the woman I had become, strong, successful, and finally secure in her own worth, stepped forward and embraced the father who had lost her. "I love you," he whispered into my shoulder. "I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to show it anymore." "I know," I whispered back. "I love you too." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Too much damage had been done for that. But it was something better. It was real healing, built on truth and justice, and the understanding that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who need our forgiveness the most. As I flew back to New York that evening, I looked down at the lights of Portland spreading out below like stars scattered across black velvet. Somewhere down there was St. Mary's Children's Home, where a scared little girl had once pressed her face against the window, watching cars drive away. And somewhere down there was the house where my family was learning to be a family again, imperfect, scarred, but finally honest about who they were and what they had done. The foundation would continue its work. More children would find homes, more families would be healed, and every success would honor that 8-year-old girl who had been deemed not worth keeping, but who had grown up to become someone worth finding again. The abandoned daughter had become the savior. The rejected child had become the redeemer. And sometimes, when justice and love finally align, even the most broken families can find their way home.